ladies and gentlemen. It's Ukrainian talk show on Pod TV. My name is Sasha Star, and I have a pleasure to have today Dr. Jonathan Lockwood. Welcome to the show, please.
Thank you, Sasha. Glad to be
Great
here.
to have you. Jonathan, I would like to ask you a question because lately more and more countries started with Germany, now it's Denmark, and others are suggesting that NATO is not ready to fight Russia for next 3 to 5, and in some cases 7 years. Okay. So what's happened, Jonathan? I think NATO was ready to meet Russia's challenge, basically all second half of last century. And today, all of a sudden, when Russia is so weakened by Ukraine fight, all of a sudden they are not ready. So what's happened?
They, I think they're being cautious. I simply think they're being cautious. They want to err on the side of pessimism because they want to convince their people. They want to convince their people, hey, this is not an easy thing we're facing. We are going to have to step up and make a collective commitment. We can see it coming. It's not a surprise attack. I mean, Putin has essentially telegraphed his punch and telegraphed his intentions, and therefore it's coming. But because the Ukrainians are putting up such a greater than expected resistance and arguably weakening Russia to the point where its offensive capability will be completely non-credible, barring the first use of nuclear weapons. And even then, we're not too sure about the reliability of their nuclear arsenal, given the fact that they do not spend that much on maintenance compared to the West. So all of this is the various European leaders of NATO are, I would say, hedging their bets. They are erring on the side of pessimism. They're gearing their people up to the mentality says, hey, this will be maybe a long struggle in which we have to face Russia down now inside of Ukraine while the threat can still be relatively easily contained and while Russia is visibly being weakened. Plus, there are also other incremental improvements come from various sources coming into Ukraine's military. Ukraine is building up its own defense capability and defense industry. And all these subtle little signs are, from my perception, showing a shift in the strategic balance between Russia and Ukraine. And that really, as one recent news report showed that the Russians were becoming visibly alarmed or disturbed by the apparent appearance of F-16s in Ukraine. And once those aircraft start stepping into the fight in significant numbers, now again, some observers said, oh no, the Ukrainians will need at least 120 F-16s in order to be able to do anything significant. Keep in mind, this is again an instance where observers have underestimated the effectiveness of Ukrainian use of the weapons that they have been given. And the Ukrainians are continuing to exceed Western expectations and certainly Russian expectations of their ability to resist and counterpunch. So I would say that, yes, while there is a lot of pessimism, keep in mind, if you look back at the statements that were being made by the various Western powers during World War II, oh, good heavens. You were thinking that World War II was going to last longer than it did, and that as late as 1942, mid to late 1942, it wasn't until about the end of 1942 where you had the great battles in World War II that proved to be, in retrospect, the turning point. The Battle of Stalingrad in Russia, the Battle of El Alamein in North Africa, turning points in the Battle of the Atlantic as the U-boat destruction began going up. Even as the Axis was sinking a record number of tonnage, they were also starting to take record numbers of losses in U-boats. So all of this was, in retrospect, a turning point, even though at the time, had you been in this situation at the time looking forward, you would have gotten nothing but pessimism on the part of remember, the Allies also, the U.S. and Brits also had Operation Sledgehammer. That was a plan for an emergency invasion of the French continent in 1942 should the Soviet Union collapse, because they thought there was a very real danger that the Soviet Union might be knocked out of the war by the Nazis.
Before the Stalingrad, actually, there
Exactly. Before Stalingrad, when the Nazis had launched their offensive, not too many people noticed that the Nazis were not launching an offensive on all three fronts as they had in 1941. They had taken such losses that they had to confine their offensive to one sector of the front. They had to choose, do we go against Leningrad? Do we go against Moscow? Do we go against Stalingrad? They opted to go against Stalingrad and try to take the oil fields. That was because they had taken enough losses and they were stretched so thin that they could not afford to wage an all-out offensive on all three fronts on the Eastern Front, sectors of the Eastern Front. So this was not noticed very much at the time. If we use that lesson, that analogy, and we apply it now to the Ukrainian situation, Ukraine has committed its assault brigade to the defense of Avdiivka, with what I project will be noticeably decisive effect in halting that offensive and inflicting even greater casualties on the Russians than expected. And so right now it is a tipping point, but I would say that the accumulated effectiveness that the Ukrainians will gain as they incorporate all these various new weapon systems from various sources are going to make their effectiveness felt in the coming months. And I predict that we will see a decisive counterstroke on the part of Ukraine against the Russians, again, in particular, severing the link between Russia and Crimea. That is the most obviously vulnerable sector of the front for the Russians. And they are very tenuously maintaining that supply line, which is in increasing danger from Ukrainian actions. And as the Ukrainians employ greater numbers of drones, oh my heavens, that's becoming a decisive new weapon of war. And it's compensating for the Ukrainians' weaknesses.
Well, I noticed even today when they had replacement of the top Ukrainian general Zaluzhny with General Syrsky. So there is a reorganization on the top echelon of Ukrainian army. Even with all that, just last night, Ukrainians were able to liquidate well over 1,000 Russian soldiers, 19 artillery systems, 8 tanks, and such a day as usual. Nothing really happened. The Russians are still working for several months to take over Avdiivka, which I, trust me, never heard about this name in my life. But anyways, they're working very hard. So
well, people weren't thinking about Bastogne during World War II in the Ardennes. They didn't think Bastogne was going to become such a central battleground until you look at a map and you saw that Bastogne was the center of a road network in Belgium. So, but anyway, it's amazing how otherwise obscure towns and places can assume great significance. Who has ever done before World War One?
This is what's interesting, is that this is as an argument or counter argument to Western pessimism about fighting Russia, is saying, okay, so you're scared that Russia will go and take over Baltic and Poland and what, Germany perhaps, and going even farther. They cannot take Avdiivka for several months now. So that's
why are we being pessimistic? And when the Russians are being pummeled, taking on the Ukrainians, which are proving to be more worthy opponents than the Russians expected.
Well, so my question is this, that the typical NATO doctrine of the last century was that Russian, at least right after Second World War, they had such a great advantage in tanks and artillery and airplanes or so on. So the doctrine was that if the attack will be imminent, West will use nuclear deterrence. Because
that was essentially the massive retaliation doctrine. It was an extension of the massive retaliation doctrine of the United States, and in NATO it was essentially called the tripwire strategy. The purpose of NATO's conventional forces in the West was simply once the Russians attacked, the forces there would delay defense, delay and slowly retreat, but it simply verified the fact that, oh yes, the Soviets are attacking, and that would signal the U.S. To use its nuclear superiority to bomb the Soviets back to the Stone Age. And they
Right.
made in the end, Eisenhower and Dulles made it quite clear in their massive retaliation doctrine that we were to retaliate at a time and place of our own choosing. The implication was very clear. It's one step over the line, and we nuke you.
Okay, absolutely agree with you. And what I wanted to say though is that in 21st century, the use of nuclear retaliation became sort of not that it's no longer possible, not at all. It's just that there will be, of course, retaliation from Russia, including strategic bombers and submarines and everything else. So it will be too messy with very uncertain outcome. And even if West will prevail, there will be just too many casualties. It's unacceptable level of casualties will be there. So they rethinking their strategy of actually meeting Russian fight with conventional force. But that something requires much bigger buildup of conventional forces than West has at the present. Now there is something else. Ukraine, though, is able to fight Russian tooth to tooth in conventional war because that's what what Ukrainian learn in the same war academies. Because most of the Ukrainian generals, they completed the same war education, military education, as Russian generals. So they understand their way of thinking, understand their way of fighting. And Ukraine, although much smaller and weaker country than Russia, they are quite successful to withstand already for almost 2 years Russian attacks. Now, the question, though, is, are the Western countries like Baltic states or Denmark or any other countries would be able to find a way to fight the way the Ukraine fights? There is also something else I would like to, I think I mentioned a couple of times that several years ago I've studied Alexander Dugin writings. And he goes into all kind of theories of sea people and land people, and he's talking about the United States and England, all others being sea people, and they are always relying on their fleet, the naval power. And even if there is a war, so how they fight, they're using complete superiority in naval power and air power, and therefore they can defeat almost any opponent quite easily, or so on. And the land powers like Russia and to a certain extent Germany, also land power, and many others. So these are relying primarily on the conventional army, like soldiers, foot soldiers, the artillery, quite heavily, other systems. And Dugin is analyzing that if there would be a conventional continental war of Russia against any other Western power, Russia would easily overcome there, except Ukraine. Ukraine is not a naval.
One giant speed bump in the way of the Russian steamroller.
So who needs European powers to fight Russia when there is a Ukraine who is doing that quite successfully?
Hey, go get them, Yukis. Here are weapons. Here, we'll give you more weapons, as many weapons as you need.
So
ideally, go ahead.
No, I want to say if Dugin would follow through his own theories, he would say that Ukraine, being a continental power, same as Russia, therefore understand and prepared, knows how to fight continental war. There is no more stronger enemy to fight Russia except Ukraine. Ukraine
Right.
is
So there you have presented a very compelling argument for Ukraine to be incorporated into NATO and to become
absolutely.
essentially to become the eastern bulwark of European defense for European defense,
Yeah.
and if we were to act with true justice and compassion, once we force Russia to cease and to retreat back behind its borders, that we should immediately begin the economic as well as military reconstruction of Ukraine, to get their peoples that left Ukraine at the beginning of the war. Okay, come back now. We need you to help rebuild Ukraine. We need you to help make Ukraine into make Ukraine great, not a great again, but make Ukraine great, period. so they would become a stalwart defender and a welcome member of the European community. And there would be a lot of gratitude on the part of the Western European powers and Scandinavian nations that have joined NATO, and you would have a potential for being able to maintain the peace and strategic stability for the remainder of the 21st century. All it takes is patience and persistence and perseverance, for that matter, in being able to resist the Russian aggression and find a way to counterpunch it. To find a suitable asymmetric response to Russian aggression that will enable the United States and its NATO allies to bring a halt to the Russian aggression, and again, even though Ivan was saying on a previous program that the solution that I was prescribing, the construction of a global ballistic missile defense, to neutralize Russia's nuclear arsenal, and by extension, China, North Korea, Iran, those nuclear arsenals would be the key to establishing long-term strategic stability for the remainder of the 21st century. You have to take a long view, but then you have to have a bridge in between that end point, that end state, and what we are experiencing now. What is necessary now is for Ukraine, with sufficient help from its allies, to find that crucial counterpunch that cripples the Russian offensive and forces Russia to recognize reality, and reluctantly accept a ceasefire and withdraw behind its former borders. It is still quite possible, contrary to what a number of more pessimistic Western analysts are saying, and I believe that they are saying this because they are thinking primarily of their own reputations. They are not thinking about Ukraine or about the objective reality of the situation, because they don't want to look bad. They don't want to look foolish. They want to be able to say, "I told you this was going to happen." Now, you have to be able to look at a situation and recognize that it is not certain situations are not inevitable. It is not inevitable that Russia is going to win in Ukraine. Elon Musk, okay, if you might have seen his recent, he was saying that Russia is going to win in Ukraine. That and others are saying that the idea of a Ukrainian victory is a pipe dream. Well, with Elon, you have to take a look at some of his other statements and some of his other things, simply because, now, to be sure, he has reintroduced reusable spacecraft. That's a very useful development. It has a lot of potential. But then again, you also look at his statements where he wants to go to Mars. He wants to use his starships to transport 100 colonists at a time to Mars. Okay, you take a look at that spacecraft, the specifications for it. You're thinking of taking essentially 100 plus colonists and crew, putting it into a chemically powered spacecraft that is not much bigger than one of our modern airliners, and taking them on a slow trip to Mars, which would take about 6 to 7 months to get there. 6 to 7 months with 100 plus colonists in a chemically powered spacecraft. Yeah, it's just totally unrealistic. Elon has once said that it was his hope that he would one day die on Mars. Well, I've got news for him. If he gets into a space starship with 100 plus colonists on a slow 6 to 7 month trip to Mars with minimal provisions for amenities and so forth, they're going to make sure he dies before he gets to Mars.
I think you should listen to this old song. I want to take you to a slow boat to China. More realistic, probably.
It makes about as much sense as that. I mean, realistically, others have looked at the specifications, for example, of Musk's Starship, and they say that it realistically has the capability for supporting a crew of 10 for a long term. Now, mind you, that's not so great for colonizing Mars, but it does make sense if you're looking at buying a space fleet. You know, those would be perfectly adequate for Space Force personnel to carry out multiple missions in Earth orbit and toward a lunar base. And this may, I suspect this may be what Elon was thinking about all along, eventually being able to sell a space fleet to the Pentagon. And that would make a great deal. And it could be used very quickly.
But Pentagon just admitted a couple of days ago that it has no money to maintain.
They're basically they're saying we have no money. That's basically they're saying we've just about maxed out our credit card.
Yep.
But then there are. The thing is, I regard that as something of a false argument. It says we have no more money. As a no, you are spending money on the wrong things. For example, in the current budget proposals for the Pentagon, they are talking about spending another $181 billion on building more nuclear weapon systems. That tells me that there too many leaders in the Pentagon have allowed themselves to be lulled by the strategic orthodoxy that has been governing Western military thinking for the past several decades. They believe that the offense will always be able to overcome the defense when it comes to nuclear weapons. What they do not realize is that because of recent technological developments in ballistic missile defense and laser weapons and space and reusable spacecraft, all these factors are coming together in a way that makes possible what I've been telling you about, the creation of a global ballistic missile defense to render nuclear weapons impotent and obsolete. And once this realization dawns, when you see that the logic of an asymmetric response is when you are confronted with several powers that have nuclear arsenals, the answer is not build more nuclear weapons. The answer is build an effective ballistic missile defense to neutralize those arsenals. That is a different way of thinking, one that has not yet gained primacy in the Pentagon and in the national leadership, but which very well could under the proper circumstances.
Totally agree with you. And speaking about Musk, something just occurred to me that if he wants really to colonize Mars, then he has to pick up on Dr. Strangelove's scenario to send 100 people there, 10 males and 90 females.
Mm-hmm.
And with the reproduction, in about 20 years, they will have a really sizable population. The only thing is how to maintain and where they're going to live and the food.
Exactly. Yeah, being able to generate. The only other scenario in which that could be possible is if let's say, for example, that we are able to develop for Elon Musk's starships nuclear thermal propulsion systems rather than chemical propulsion systems. As we said, if they had those kinds of propulsion systems, you would cut the travel time between Earth and Mars to about 45 days, which is much more workable and sustainable than 6 to 7 months. And if you take it one step further, if you eventually develop workable fusion power generators enable us to reach the entire solar system, and it cuts the travel time to Mars down to about an estimated week or two, which makes the exploration and exploitation of the resources of the solar system much more feasible.
Well, 1-2 weeks is like all-inclusive vacation, basically.
Yeah, exactly. You cut it down to something that's thinkable. and with sufficient amenities, you have something that's very workable and economically sustainable. But the trick is you have to have the right combination of technologies and invest in those technologies and recognize when it is time vis-a-vis your opponents to adopt an asymmetric response, merely not simply copying what they have and trying to and thinking that more of everything is better.
Then
Just like
about
yeah,
governing,
yeah.
would they have to select the attorney general and general governor to actually administer this Mars colony or something? Like who's going to
Oh
run it?
yeah, the politics. Yeah, the politics of who runs this colony. Oh,
Absolutely.
that's going to be lovely. Yeah, because people forget that you know that they should have some religious ministers accompanying this group to remind them that you are flawed, you are morally flawed, and that you don't send a bunch of morally flawed people with no ethical guidelines or teaching into a high stress situation like a Mars colony. Oh, that is just asking for complete disaster.
And what about the same-sex marriages? Probably would be forbidden because it would it would disbalance the male-females population there. So
I
that we have to go. And we're running into a lot of difficult questions.
do not. I do
Maybe
not.
Musk will
Yeah,
know the
yeah.
answers.
I do not see a future for a Mars colony, not a colony simply for growing a major population. I see a future settlement of Mars for the purpose of a mining colony, a scientific colony where people could expect to come back
Absolutely.
after serving a certain time, and then that could be sustainable because people don't want to go to Mars to die. They want to go to Mars and with the expectation of coming back to a more rewarding existence on Earth, maybe being paid a big fat bonus, maybe being
Absolutely.
regarded as heroes, getting to all those nice sorts of things that you would expect out of going on a high risk proposition like going to Mars for a set period of time. That there has to be some revised thinking. The only way that's really going to become possible is when we develop more useful propulsion systems, which can get us to Mars and to other points of the solar system much more quickly than we are able to do now. So back to Ukraine.
Yeah, and that's very interesting proposition. In the meantime, I see in the news that Russians are now using the Elon Musk's systems,
Yeah, they're
the
Starlink satellites.
Starlinks, and who is supplying it? The bunch of Arab countries who are buying it from US and supplying it to Russia. And Russia already started to use them, and I don't know if it's a legal operation because according to license agreement, I would assume that the countries who are buying the systems must use them within the country which buys it, but not uh, offering it to other countries as well. But I don't know. I'm not familiar with the license systems of Starlinks, but I think Musk would have to take care of that. And I wanted to discuss with you also this appointment of General Sirsky in place of Zaluzhny. But I think let's leave it until Friday, so we'll discuss it with Ivan. So he
Yeah,
will have.
I think Ivan will have some interesting insights on this person, and
Yeah, yeah,
it looks like it. Just from the initial appearances, it seems like Sersky is uh, being more pragmatic. He is going to be working with. He's going to. I predict he's going to make the absolute best use of the systems that he's got and the resources that he has. He is going to be like a clever boxer, looking for that nice opening for in the Russian lines to launch a decisive counterstroke, which will inflict a significant operational defeat upon Russian forces, one that they won't be able to disguise or explain away.
yeah. Yeah, I think there are also not strictly military reasons for this appointments. I think that Zelensky started to understand that his plan of victory over Russia, I mean by evicting Russia from all Ukrainian territories, is at least at this point not workable. And Zaluzhny was concentrated on going ahead with this particular plan, provided that there would be sufficient Western help, specifically US, which hasn't materialized. Therefore, he essentially he very considerably adjusted his strategy of attack in the summer of 23, which was against what NATO expected of him. But again, NATO couldn't demand that he must go according to the agreed plan, especially that the promised weapons were not forthcoming. So essentially, it all turned out to be somewhat a disaster for this campaign, and therefore the Zaluzhny's actions. And also, the most important thing, in my opinion, is that Zelensky saw in Zaluzhny his very capable nominee for the future election as a president of Ukraine, because his rating, his popularity was kind of 90% against 60-some percent of Zelensky. So he decided to do this switch. It's still very unpopular among Ukrainian people and Ukrainian army primarily. There are a lot of generals already said that they are not going to work with what's his name, Syrsky.
Mhm.
And, but okay, that's another problem that Syrsky has to overcome. There's nothing else can be done. It's an army, it's a command, and people who are not going to follow his commands will have to
It's a
leave the army.
it's a very similar problem, to use a historical analogy. It's a very similar problem to what successive Union generals experienced during the American Civil War after Lincoln replaced McClellan. McClellan was very popular among his troops. He took care of his troops, he trained them well, but McClellan's failing in Lincoln's eyes was that he simply refused to take decisive military action against the Confederate forces and often found himself outmaneuvered by Lee. And so, therefore, subsequent Union generals had the problem of not only trying to match Lee in military prowess, but also trying to match the degree of loyalty and enthusiasm that McClellan had generated among Union troops. So here you have an interesting historical analogy. Of course, if Lincoln eventually found his general in General Ulysses S. Grant and was
Yes.
able to overcome that problem, someone who was Lee's equal, if not his superior, in strategic thinking. So, in any case, there are historical analogies, and it does not mean that Syrsky will be unable to overcome this initial disadvantage. And again, I do not underestimate the ability of the Ukrainian military to pull off an operational surprise against Russian forces, especially
Another
given what they. Go ahead.
Another plus, of Syrsky could be the fact that Zaluzhny, who has actually Western military education, and he knows very well NATO doctrines and how to use, except that he had no means to to do what he was about to do. So Syrsky, on the other hand, he finished the top Russian academies, almost all Ukrainian and Russian generals. So he understands very well how Russian thinks and what they're about to do. And he doesn't really, he's not trained in NATO military doctrine. But for some, it could be a plus, because if you believe what we discussed earlier, that NATO military doctrine is not suited yet for today's Russia's offensive or so on, whereas Syrsky is well equipped to do exactly that type of fight. And much more even important than that is Syrsky is perceived as Zelensky's man, so he's a part of the team, whereas Zaluzhny may not felt as a part of the team
So
because of his
Zelensky could have been perceived in the same way that Truman perceived MacArthur, as a
Mhm.
potential political threat, as
Yes.
an insubordinate, potentially insubordinate general. So again, there are historical analogies to draw upon in looking at this situation.
And MacArthur was very popular in the army, and who knows if he
Yes.
would run for president, he could beat Eisenhower. Could be
Well,
because
that may have been the fear, but remember
Mhm.
that Eisenhower was a relatively reluctant Republican. The Republicans turned to him, and he reluctantly agreed, which was to his credit. And
Mhm.
as a result, during the Eisenhower administration, there were no wars.
Yes.
They did not get committed to any foreign wars. And interestingly enough, Eisenhower also warned the American people at the end of his administration about the potential rise of what he called the military industrial complex. And
Yes.
Eisenhower was very prophetic. He was very prophetic and very prescient, very accurate. And
Exactly.
so,
Yeah. Listen, we are living in very interesting times, and we are following that, and we will discuss it again, same place, same time on Friday. Jonathan, thank you very much for today's program. All
well,
the
thank you.
best. Slava Ukraini. Bye bye, everybody.
Right.